I woke up in a hospital bed with the ceiling lights glaring down at me like interrogators. The sharp sting of disinfectant filled my nose, and every beep of the monitor beside me reminded me I was alive, but barely. My chest ached with the weight of tubes and wires, but it wasn't the illness that hurt the most. It was her, my daughter. My only child. She stood at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed, her eyes colder than the steel rails that caged me in. For a moment I thought she'd come to comfort me, to reassure me that I wasn't alone. But the way she looked at me, like a landlord eyeing a delinquent tenant, stripped away any illusion of love. "Dad," she said. Her voice clipped, rehearsed, as though she'd practiced the lines in front of a mirror. "We need to get your affairs in order." At first, I didn't understand. My brain was still swimming from the medication, but then she opened her bag and pulled out a thick set of papers. They landed on my lap with the weight of a stone dropped into still water, rippling out shock, confusion, dread. "Transfer of ownership," she said. "It's just a formality. You agreed before, remember?" Her words sliced through me. I shook my head, but the wires and tubes made the motion weak, pitiful. I hadn't agreed to anything. My house, our house, was all I had left of my late wife. Every brick was soaked in her memory. Every creak in the floorboards was a whisper of her presence. The thought of handing it over, even temporarily, was unthinkable. "I signed nothing," I croaked, my throat dry as sand. But she didn't flinch. She leaned closer, the faint scent of her perfume, one her mother used to wear, mocking me with the memory of a gentler past. She slid the top page toward me and tapped where a signature sprawled in shaky, slanted letters. My name, my handwriting, my stomach turned. "No," I whispered. "That's not," but it was. My name, my signature. Proof on paper that I'd already surrendered the one place that had carried me through half a century of storms. I wanted to shout, to rip the papers in half, to demand an explanation, but my body betrayed me. My heart monitor screamed as I tried to sit up, and a nurse hurried in, fussing, pushing my daughter aside. My strength crumbled under the weight of betrayal. In that moment, I realized what was at stake. Not just the house, not just the walls and roof I had bled and sweated to keep standing. It was my dignity, my place in the world, my sense of belonging. If she truly meant to take this from me, I would lose not only my home, but my last fragile tether to family. The nurse scolded her softly, saying I needed rest. My daughter gave a practiced sigh and left the papers on the table by my bed. She smoothed her coat, slung her bag over her shoulder, and looked at me as though I were already gone. "I'm only doing what's best for everyone," she said flatly, and then she left. The room was quiet again, except for the slow drip of the IV. My hands shook as I reached for the papers, staring at the crooked version of my own name inked across the page. Had she forged it? Or had I, in a haze of sickness and pain, scrawled it without realizing? The questions burned hotter than the fever in my veins. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness I saw my wife's face. She would never have believed this. She had adored our daughter, spoiled her, defended her even when I thought she was ungrateful. "She's our girl," she used to say. "She'll take care of you when I'm gone." But here I was, alone in a sterile room, papers claiming my life's work slipping from my trembling fingers. And the cruelest part? I couldn't prove anything. All I knew was this: I had signed nothing. And yet my house, my past, my security, my sanctuary, was slipping through my hands like sand in a storm. The beeping of the monitor slowed as exhaustion dragged me under again. But one thought pulsed through my mind louder than any machine. If she could take my home this easily, what else could she take from me? When the hospital finally discharged me, I thought stepping outside would taste like freedom. Instead, it tasted like fear. The air was crisp, but each breath seemed hollow. My legs trembled beneath me as I made my way down the familiar streets of my neighborhood, leaning on a cane the nurse had pressed into my hand. Every step was heavier than the last, but I kept walking, repeating to myself, "Home. I'm going home. Once I'm there, everything will feel normal again." The closer I got, the faster my heart pounded. That house was more than brick and wood. It was the place where I had carried my bride across the threshold 50 years ago. It was where I painted my daughter's nursery yellow because her mother swore she wouldn't settle for pink or blue. It was where we buried the family dog beneath the oak tree, and where, after my wife's funeral, I sat by the window night after night, waiting for grief to loosen its grip. That house was my anchor. Without it, I was adrift. When I reached the gate, something was wrong. The flowers I used to tend were withered, their petals dry and brittle. The curtains were different, too. No longer the faded ones my wife had stitched, but sleek new blinds, impersonal and cold. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, the old brass one I had polished countless times. But when I turned it, the lock resisted. I twisted harder, nothing. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys. They slid in easily, but when I tried to turn them, the metal jammed. The locks had been changed. I knocked softly at first, then harder, the panic rising in me like water in a flooding basement. And then the door opened, not to my daughter, but to her husband. He filled the doorway with his smugness, his arms crossed, his lips curved into a half-smile that was anything but kind. "What are you doing here?" he asked, as if I were a stranger, as if I hadn't lived in that house longer than he'd been alive. "This is my home," I said, my voice shaking more from rage than age. "Let me in." He leaned lazily against the frame as though enjoying a private joke. "Not anymore. It's her house now. She told me you agreed. You signed the papers. Remember?" My throat closed. That cursed signature again. I had signed nothing. Yet everywhere I turned it haunted me like a ghost wearing my name. I wanted to shove him aside, storm through my own front door, collapse in my own chair, but my knees wobbled and I clung to the railing for balance. He knew I couldn't fight him. He knew the law, the lies and the locks were all on his side. "She doesn't want you here," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper, low and venomous. "You're a burden. You'll only drag us down. Best to move on, as if it were that simple to erase decades of love and sacrifice. As if my entire existence could be folded up like an old shirt and tossed aside. Rage boiled inside me, mixing with grief until I couldn't tell one from the other. I thought of every late-night shift I had worked to put food on the table. Every penny I had saved for her tuition. The wedding I had paid for down to the last flower. I thought of the way she used to run to me as a child, clutching her dolls, begging me to lift her into my arms. And now she couldn't even open her door to me. The man, my son-in-law, didn't wait for my response. He closed the door. Slowly, deliberately. And the click of the lock was louder than any slam. I stood there staring at the wood until the world blurred through my tears. I had nowhere to go. My feet shuffled to the curb and I sat on the cold concrete, an old man with a cane cast out like trash. Neighbors peeked through curtains but said nothing. No one wants to involve themselves in another man's family tragedy. When night fell, I curled myself against the wall, pulling my thin jacket tighter, listening to the muffled laughter spilling out from inside my own house. They were eating dinner, clinking glasses, living comfortably beneath the roof I had built with my hands. I pressed my forehead to my knees and prayed to my wife's memory for strength, and then, just as exhaustion dragged me down, a sound startled me. A faint scrape against the door, followed by the soft slide of paper across the ground. I looked up. There it was, an envelope pushed from the other side resting against my shoe. I reached for it with trembling fingers, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't from her, not from my daughter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the strokes urgent, almost desperate. On the front, in uneven letters, were just 4 words. I know the truth. The letter that slid beneath my door became the thread I clung to in the darkness. I unfolded it again and again, my eyes tracing the shaky words, "I know the truth." There was no signature, no return address, only a phone number scrawled at the bottom. Desperation pushed me to dial it, my hands trembling as I clutched the payphone receiver in the corner of the gas station down the street. A man's voice answered. Calm, familiar in a way that unsettled me. "You don't know me, but I knew your wife. She trusted me once. And she'd want me to help you now. Meet me tomorrow, downtown, my office." The next day I stepped into a dimly lit law office that smelled faintly of leather and dust. Behind the desk sat a man older than me, his gray hair combed neatly back, his eyes sharp despite the wrinkles etched deep into his face. He introduced himself as Daniel. My wife had once worked with him years ago, when he was still rising through the ranks. He remembered her fondly, with a reverence that made my chest ache. "You're in trouble," he said without hesitation, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were documents, pages stamped with seals, words that blurred together, but the meaning was clear. My daughter had filed legal action. Not only was the house in dispute, but she wanted me declared unfit, incompetent. She wanted me removed permanently. Not just from the property, but from my own name. She's claiming you're unable to care for yourself, Daniel explained. That you've been abusive, neglectful, unstable. She's painting a picture of a man who doesn't deserve to manage his own affairs. I stared at the papers, my pulse hammering. Words like abusive and unfit leapt off the page, stabbing me deeper than any knife could. My own daughter, the child I had rocked to sleep, the girl I had worked double shifts for, was painting me as a monster. It wasn't just a house anymore. It wasn't about bricks or walls. It was my entire identity on trial. If she won, I wouldn't just lose a home. I would lose my dignity, my reputation, my right to exist as myself. I would become nothing more than a forgotten old man, shuffling the streets with no name, no family, and no past anyone cared to believe. Daniel leaned forward. We can fight this, but it won't be easy. She has witnesses, her husband, her friends, even neighbors ready to testify that you're volatile, difficult. Do you have anyone who will speak for you? The question struck me like a hammer. Did I? My brothers were long gone. My friends. Most were buried by now, and the few still alive had drifted away after my wife's death. I realized with a hollow ache that I had no one. No one but her, and she had turned against me. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the tiny rented room Daniel had arranged for me, staring at the cracked ceiling. Doubt gnawed at me, louder than the rats scratching in the walls. Had I failed her? I thought back to her teenage years, the arguments we had, the times I'd said no when she wanted yes. Did she carry those moments like scars? Did she grow up believing I had been too hard, too cold? The guilt crushed me until my chest felt like it might collapse. Maybe I had failed her without even realizing it. Maybe she truly hated me. But another thought whispered through the guilt. Or maybe someone else was whispering poison in her ear. Someone who wanted my house, my money, my disappearance. Her husband's smug face flashed in my mind and my fists clenched. The next morning, Daniel called me back into his office. His expression was grave, his hand gripping a sealed envelope. He slid it across the desk toward me. This, he said slowly, may destroy her case, but it may also destroy you. I stared at the envelope, its weight seeming far greater than the paper it held. My heart pounded in my ears as I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the seal. What's inside? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. His silence was worse than any words. Finally, he said, proof of things you don't yet know, proof that could turn the tide. But once opened, you can never unknow what's inside. The envelope sat between us like a loaded gun, and in that moment I realized the fight wasn't just for a house. It was for the truth itself. When the world turns its back on you, there is a strange silence that follows, like the muffled ringing after a heavy blow to the head. That was the silence I lived in after being pushed out of my home. My memories packed into a plastic shopping bag, my dignity crumpled like an old receipt. I spent my nights wandering the streets until exhaustion pinned me to a park bench beneath a flickering lamp, the shadows of the trees stretching over me like skeletal fingers. I had never imagined I would end up here, alone, discarded, reduced to a nobody in a city where my own blood had turned into my enemy. It was a bitter night, one of those nights where the wind doesn't just cut through your coat, it cuts through your very bones, reminding you how fragile flesh can be when stripped of warmth. My stomach ached, not only from hunger but from the shame of admitting I had nothing left. And then, in that abyss of despair, a voice broke the silence. You look like you could use something warm, the stranger said. I turned, startled. A man stood before me, middle-aged, his clothes simple but clean, his eyes carrying that rare softness you don't often see anymore. He held out a small container of soup, steam curling upward into the cold night air. I wanted to refuse. Pride is the last shield of a broken man, and mine still clung to me like a stubborn ghost. But the hunger gnawed too deeply, and so I took it, my hand trembling more from shame than from cold. The first sip burned my tongue, but it was the sweetest pain I had ever known. Salt, warmth, and something else, a reminder that I was still human, still alive. That first taste cracked something inside me. I had held myself together with bitterness and anger. But that night, with that simple act of kindness, my defenses began to crumble. You don't have to tell me your story, he said, settling onto the bench beside me. But I can see you've got one. Everyone sitting on a bench like this does. I didn't answer. My throat was too tight. He didn't press further. And in that silence, I realized that sometimes strangers can feel less dangerous than family. For weeks that followed, he became my anchor. His name was Rafik, a factory worker who had once known hunger himself. He didn't have much, but he shared what he had. A blanket one night, an extra piece of bread another. He guided me toward the shelters, the places where men like me drifted in and out, ghosts of broken homes and broken promises. It was humiliating at first, standing in line for a bed, my identity stripped away with each form I filled out. Widower, I wrote in the blank space, though it felt like a half-truth. My wife was gone, yes, but so was my daughter. The shelter smelled of disinfectant and despair. Men snored on cots lined up like coffins. Others whispered about families that no longer wanted them. In those hushed voices, I found fragments of my own story repeated again and again. Betrayal, abandonment, survival. I wasn't unique. I was part of a silent brotherhood of fathers cast out by their own blood. Still, every time I sat in those shelters, I wrestled with a single question. If my own child could betray me, was I even worthy of love? The thought carved deeper into me than hunger ever could. Nights stretched into endless reflections, memories of her as a child flashing before me. The way she once clung to my leg on her first day of school. The way she cried when I told her bedtime stories. The way she whispered "Papa" like it was the safest word in the world. How had that girl grown into the woman who now filed papers to erase me from her life? And yet, even as despair tried to chain me, Rafik's presence reminded me of something I had long forgotten. That family is not always bound by blood. Sometimes it's bound by kindness, by survival, by the sharing of one warm bowl of soup on a cold night. It was on one such night, after weeks of this fragile routine, that I found it. At the bottom of the soup bowl, as I scraped the last of the broth with shaking hands, there was a folded note, damp and clinging to the porcelain. My heart paused. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my daughter's. My breath caught in my throat, my chest tightening as if the world itself was squeezing the air out of me. But the words written on that paper weren't meant for me. They were addressed to someone else, and in that moment, I realized this stranger's kindness was not as simple as it seemed. I unfolded the damp note with trembling hands, my eyes scanning the familiar loops of her handwriting. At first I thought it was some apology, some desperate cry for forgiveness that had been mistakenly passed to me. But as the words revealed themselves, my heart turned cold. It wasn't for me. It was a message to him, her husband. Words wrapped in fear, pleading in tone. She wrote of debts I never knew existed, of threats whispered late at night, of choices she was forced to make under the weight of secrets too heavy for her to carry alone. The betrayal I had believed to be hers suddenly shifted shape, taking on the darker outline of another man's hand. He was blackmailing her. My daughter, my flesh and blood. The revelation struck me like a blade between the ribs. All this time I had hated her for what she had done, for casting me out, for tearing the very roof from over my head. But the note revealed another truth. She wasn't just my betrayer. She was also a prisoner. The stakes of my life suddenly changed. It was no longer only about a house or even my survival. It was about her soul. If I exposed him, I risked cutting whatever fragile thread still connected us as father and daughter. She might see me as an enemy, an intruder in her marriage. But if I stayed silent, I would lose everything. Not only my home and name, but the last chance to protect the child I had raised. The girl who had once trusted me above all else. The conflict tore me in half. A part of me wanted to bury the note and walk away. After all, hadn't she already chosen him over me? Why should I fight a battle she had brought into her own life? But then I would hear her laughter echoing in my memory. See her small hand gripping mine when she was afraid of the dark. Feel the phantom weight of her head resting on my chest when she was a child. Could I really let her drown in silence? And so began my quiet investigation. I was no detective. I was just an old man with weary bones and a battered pride. But desperation sharpens the mind. I began by haunting the places where whispers gather, tea shops, market corners, bank lobbies. I sought out old contacts, men who still remembered me not as a discarded relic, but as someone who once stood with a measure of dignity. Piece by piece, the picture formed. There were debts, yes, debts buried under false names and hidden accounts. There were loans taken from men who smiled with gold teeth and spoke in threats disguised as favors. And there, at the center of it all, stood my son-in-law. He was no victim of circumstance. He was the author of it, He had pulled my daughter into his darkness, binding her with chains she could not see but could only feel. Every discovery cut deeper than the last. With each confirmation of his deceit, I felt rage stirring in me. Rage not only for myself, but for her. He had stolen her trust, just as he had stolen my home. But alongside the fury came guilt. Had I failed her so completely that she chose to hide this from me? Had I been so wrapped in my own grief after my wife's death that I left her vulnerable to this man's poison? Those thoughts haunted me as much as the evidence I gathered. Still, I pressed on. My hands shook as I sorted through the fragments of proof, photocopies of loan papers, whispers of forged checks, murmurs of bribes. And then one evening I found it, the final piece of evidence. It was a record from the bank, a transfer made months ago, large enough to sink a small family, and there, clear as day, was my name signed beneath it. My signature. Except I had never touched those papers. My hand had never held that pen. He had stolen not only my house, but my very identity. He had reached into my life and carved out the last remnants of who I was, turning my name into a weapon against me. I stared at the paper until the words blurred, my vision burning with a mixture of tears and fury. This wasn't just betrayal. This was annihilation. And yet the hardest truth of all was this. If I brought this evidence forward, it would destroy him. But it might also destroy her. My daughter, the only piece of family I had left in this world. The paper trembled in my hand. My choice hung heavy in the air. Do I protect her or do I save myself? The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale air, the kind of air that clung to your clothes and refused to let go. It was a place where lives were measured in paper and ink, where dignity could be stripped away with a single ruling. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands trembling not from weakness but from the weight of everything I carried. Across from me, my daughter sat beside her husband, her eyes fixed on the floor. She never once looked at me. Not once. Her husband, though, he met my gaze with the confidence of a predator who believed his prey had already been devoured. He smirked, that same curling sneer I had seen the day he barred me from my own house. That day he was just a man with arrogance. Today he was a man about to be unmasked. At least that was what I prayed. The judge, an older man with lines carved deep into his face, shuffled the papers before him. He looked weary, as if he had heard every kind of lie that humans could spin. My case was just another in a long parade of human misery. Yet for me, this was not just another case. This was my life, my name, my truth. My lawyer, an old friend of my late wife, stood and cleared his throat. His voice was steady, calm, the way a man sounds when he knows he holds something solid in his hands. He began not with the forged papers, not with the debts, not even with the note. He began with me. He told the story of who I was, my years of hard work, the house built brick by brick with my wife's laughter stitched into the walls, the sacrifices made for my daughter's future. He painted me not as a victim, but as a father. For the first time in months, I felt seen. Then came the evidence. Piece by piece, like stones laid in a path, the forged signature on the bank transfer, the records of hidden debts, the whispers from men my lawyer had quietly brought forward. Each exhibit struck like a hammer against the fortress of lies my son-in-law had built. And yet my daughter sat frozen. Her silence was louder than any accusation. Every time my lawyer spoke her name, I wished she would rise, would tell the truth, would stand on my side as the child I had raised. But she remained in his shadow, her hands knotted in her lap. It wasn't anger I felt then, it was grief. A grief deeper than the loss of a house, deeper than the ache of betrayal. It was the grief of realizing that even truth could not always free the people you love most. The defense tried, of course. They painted me as delusional, as a bitter old man seeking revenge. They waved papers that claimed I was abusive, neglectful, unfit. Lies so vile they almost choked me. But my lawyer did not falter. He brought the forged transfer forward, my stolen signature gleaming on the page. This, he said, his voice ringing in the chamber, is the handwriting not of a father but of a thief. For the first time, the smirk faltered on my son-in-law's face. It was small, almost imperceptible, but I saw it, and in that moment I knew we had pierced the armor. Still, the silence from my daughter was unbearable. She would not speak. Whether out of fear, love, or chains I could not see, she remained silent, and that silence cut deeper than any lie. The judge sat back, his eyes shifting between the evidence and the faces before him. The room seemed to hold its breath. My chest felt tight as if my very heart had wrapped itself around this moment. Finally, he leaned forward, his hands folded. His voice was measured, heavy with finality. "I've heard enough," he said. The words dropped into the air like stones into water, sending ripples through my soul. My daughter's husband shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening on the table. My lawyer glanced at me, his eyes steady but unreadable. The judge's gaze fell directly on me and then on her. He paused long enough for silence to claw at the walls. "My ruling is..." The verdict came down like thunder. I sat there stiff and trembling while the gavel struck the desk, its echo ricocheting through my bones like a reminder of everything I had lost. But the strange part was this. It wasn't the house I had fought for so desperately, not the inheritance that had been dangled before me like a cruel bait. It was something else, something heavier, something I hadn't realized I had been clawing after all along. It was my name. And in that courtroom, before strangers and witnesses, I got it back. My name, cleansed from the lies, the slander, the filth my own blood had dragged me through. They could take the walls I once called home, strip me of the furniture, the heirlooms, the land soaked with memories. But they could not take me. The papers were signed. The case was closed, and yet, as I walked out of the courthouse clutching the hollow victory, I felt my daughter's eyes burning into me from across the marble steps. She didn't come closer. She didn't say my name. She didn't smile. My heart yearned for her, but all I saw in her face was distance, a canyon I could no longer cross. Perhaps she believed the lies. Perhaps she simply didn't care to know the truth anymore. Whatever it was, I had won a battle, but I had lost her, and that loss bled deeper than any verdict could heal. I had no house to return to. The old doors would not open for me again, no matter how much I knocked. But fate, in its crooked mercy, had given me a path I hadn't expected. Do you remember the stranger I told you about? The one who had handed me soup on that rain-washed night, when I was nothing more than a broken man stumbling in a world too sharp for his bleeding hands? That stranger had a name, Imran. A man of quiet kindness, a man who carried his own invisible scars, though he rarely spoke of them. He lived in a modest flat above a shop that smelled of fresh bread in the mornings and fried onions at dusk. And when he learned that I had nowhere left to go, he did not hesitate. He opened his door. "You don't need to thank me," he said when I stepped into that room. "We all fall. Sometimes all we need is someone to help us stand." It was a small place. The walls were chipped, the curtains too thin to block the morning light. The bed creaked like it remembered better years. But it was warm. It was safe. And it was mine, if only borrowed. For the first time in months, I did not feel like an intruder in my own story. Still, acceptance was not easy. I would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, my chest tightening with shame. How had it come to this, that a stranger's mercy was the only roof I had? My mind would circle back to my daughter, to the way her silence wrapped around me like chains. The betrayal of family cut like glass. But the presence of Imran and later, of the small circle of people he called friends, people who welcomed me without question, stitched something back together in me. I began to understand that after a long day of searching for work, but chosen family, I found myself unpacking the single box I had managed to salvage from the ruins of my old life. Inside it, tucked carefully in a frame, was a photograph of my wife. Her smile, frozen in time, glowed like a lantern in the shadows of that room. I placed it gently by the window, where the fading sunlight would catch her face every evening. And as I stood there, hands trembling but heart strangely steady, I whispered to her, "I've survived, my love, and I will keep surviving." The room was silent, yet in that silence I felt her. Not gone, not erased, but here, in the fragile space I had carved out from the wreckage. And though the night still waited outside, though storms still gathered in the distance, I knew then I was not finished. Not yet.